I'm sure you've probably noticed, but I've been gone for a while. And the reason for that is that I needed to travel to the UK for a personal reason unrelated to tourism. That said, I did spend just over 2 weeks in London and used this opportunity to sightsee and experience many attractions within the city itself, many of which were incredibly interesting through their historical significance, or were just notable through being weird and quirky. Immediately, I know people must be wondering if I have plans to visit any UK theme parks, and I definitely do, as I'll be traveling the country for a month this upcoming June, where I'll be visiting parks like Blackpool Pleasure Beach, Alton Towers, and Chessington World of Adventures, among a few other parks and attractions throughout the country. But for the moment, I thought it would be interesting to produce a video about the attractions I experienced in London, even if most of them are not related to themed entertainment. In the past, I've diversified what I've covered on the channel by exploring zoological exhibits and aquariums, or even producing a video on Kennedy Space Center, all of which I managed to fit under the theme park theme of the channel. But I think it would also be interesting to diversify the videos I put out to be more broadly travel focused on occasion, because really, how could you not find a place like London fascinating, full of historic buildings and some of the world's best museums? I don't anticipate this video doing as well as the theme park content, but if you'd like to support me, you can leave a like to help boost the video, and after watching, I would also be interested in your feedback, letting me know if you think I should diversify what I cover on the channel as well, traveling to more cities and attractions not related to the themed industry. Of course, that's not to say that London doesn't offer themed attractions either, as I experienced some which were really fun standouts. It could probably be entire videos in themselves. But as someone who has a wide range of interests, especially in the historic sites and museums that London is so full of, I wanted to share my opinions and experiences after traveling around the city for 2 weeks, simply because I thought that it would be interesting. If you're visiting London, I think that one of its strongest collections of experiences can be found with its museums. Many are absolutely massive and full of historically significant artifacts, which are absolutely surreal to behold in person, and of the few I visited, I think I found the British Museum to be the most fascinating. The massive scope of the museum cannot be overstated, as despite spending the entire day here, there were entire exhibits that I completely missed, because I spent most of the day prioritizing ancient history with Assyria, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. The descriptive word I continue coming back to with London's museums is surreal, because to actually witness massive carved Egyptian stonework that is thousands of years old, or to view the incredible intricacy and detail of art from ancient Greece, it's just impossible to convey the feeling of standing in its presence through simply just watching it on video. Some of my favorite artifacts throughout the British Museum are the Athenian hydria, or water pots, which are of course famous works of art, but are fascinating to behold in person. There's something immensely intriguing about studying their carefully crafted detail, knowing that another person not unlike ourselves today sat down and delicately designed these pieces of art, which were probably considered ubiquitous in the time that they existed. Perhaps I'm just being a bit overdramatic, but to study and view the museum's artifacts in person creates a strange, almost visceral connection to the past that is indescribable if you know the stories and history behind them. For example, it's one thing to view Greek armor and helmets in popular media today, but to actually stand in front of an actual item, knowing that a real person once fought and might have died while wearing it, evokes such a strange, almost transcendental feeling. The demographics of the museum very much included tourists, but I would often hear comments from academics or students who had traveled here, and I thought it was amusing to hear their hushed reverence as they excitedly viewed an artifact in person, because they must have even more additional context than I do. The most popular artifact in the museum was easily the Rosetta Stone, which was critical in allowing scholars to learn how to read Egyptian hieroglyphs. The busiest overall area was the exhibit dedicated to mummification, which, in addition to the extensive collection of artifacts related to the Egyptian afterlife, I'll once again reuse the word surreal to describe the actual mummies on display, which I won't show on screen, but it's bizarre viewing them, knowing that these were real people who lived and died. Moving out of the exhibits, the center of the British Museum is known as the Great Court, and is covered by a large steel and glass structure. The building in the center is surrounded by extensive gift shops on its perimeter, and up above is a decent restaurant, but inside it contains an extensive academic library known as the Reading Room. It's an impressive library under a beautiful rotunda, and while you can view it as part of the attraction, it does serve an actual functional purpose for historic scholars. The British Museum is fascinating in all of its aspects, and it's not something you can experience in one day, at least not if you want to get anything meaningful out of it. So if you're interested in world history, and especially ancient history, this is one of the best museums anywhere in the world. Moving on, another standout attraction is the Natural History Museum, which is actually an extension of the British Museum, despite the buildings being located roughly 3 miles from each other. Opening in 1881, this impressive and ornate original building is known as the Cathedral to Nature, and walking in, its sheer size is quite impressive. Along the outside of the building and inside the main hall, there are decorative elements of carved flora and fauna, only enhancing the magnificent artistry of the building. As impressive as it is, the main attraction is of course natural history itself, and the skeleton of a blue whale hanging from the ceiling certainly makes an impression. Walking around the hall, alcoves set into the wall display the casts of bones from animals as impressive as the Mantellisaurus to the structure of a giant mammoth. Just a warning, but I'm going to show a lot of taxidermy or preserved animals going forward, so look away if that makes you queasy. But to discuss the layout of the museum, it is divided into different sections broadly based on types of animals. For example, there is a literal hallway dedicated to just birds, with display cases full of an eclectic collection of specimens that have been studied for hundreds of years, many of which predate this building by a substantial amount of time. This means that not only have some of them faded from light exposure, but the museum actually contains a small collection of animals, mostly birds and mammals, that have gone extinct. Other halls include reptiles and amphibians, and one of my favorites were the displays for fish. I have always been fascinated by deep-sea creatures, and there are some that are preserved and put on display here, which is likely one of the very few places you can see certain species, such as anglerfish, unless you actually dive into the ocean depths. Of the displays, the Hall of Mammals is the largest and is notable for its multiple whale skeletons that hang from the ceiling. While not as extensive as I thought it would be, the museum also contains an exhibit that features dinosaur bones as well. This was pretty interesting, although brief, and I liked how the museum incorporated animatronics to illustrate how these animals might have looked and moved. In another part of the museum, animatronic dinosaurs are actually found in the entry area of the T-Rex restaurant, which has no relation to the T-Rex Cafe in Disney Springs, but the restaurant itself is located off of the prehistoric marine reptiles hall, which, like the dinosaurs, are impressive through their sheer size. The Natural History Museum has extensive geological exhibits as well, which not only teach about the formation of natural elements from the earth, but also contains a ridiculous collection of material, from rock to gemstones, and to material like shells and pearls. It was interesting to see how much of this has been incorporated into human-made products, ranging from weapons to jewelry to Egyptian death masks, and the sheer variety of natural material is eye-opening. While the Natural History Museum is very large and can take up an entire day, it is less dense than the British Museum, and you can reasonably experience all of it from open to close. To finish off this museum segment of the video, I did want to briefly mention the Victoria and Albert Museum, which I was not aware of until spotting its building adjacent to the Natural History Museum, which I left as it closed at 4. The Victoria and Albert Museum was open until 6 though, and walking in without knowing what it was, I quickly discovered that it's an art and design museum that covers hundreds of years. Unfortunately, having only spent around 2 hours here, I was only able to cover the section dedicated to the medieval and Renaissance periods of Europe, which are massive but only a small segment of what the museum contains. Like the British Museum, it was fascinating to view how much human effort went into such intricate art, much of which naturally was related to Christianity. It really provides a lot of insight into how important religion has been historically in shaping European culture, which was on display through such insane works of art. And while I would have liked to have returned to the Victoria and Albert Museum, I couldn't find the time with so many other appointments and activities. Within the museum, there are many other halls dedicated to art and design, ranging from an extensive exhibit on Britain, to the Middle East, and to countries and cultures from East Asia. Having only gotten a small taste of its scale, I imagine that, like the British Museum, this is an attraction that you might not be able to fully see without dedicating at least 2 days to it, so I was disappointed not to spend more time here. If you're not interested in museums, then there are a small number of attractions in the city that I would categorize as themed, and one of the highlights was Madame Tussauds, the famous wax museum that started right here in London and has been delighting tourists with wax figures since 1835. The only other location I've been to is the one in Orlando, and while I understand the appeal for many, it's very much focused on film and celebrities. The celebrity portions just aren't very interesting to me, but what I like about the location in London is that this only takes up about the first quarter of the experience rather than most of it. The attraction is always changing, so your experience may be different than mine if you've been, but on walking inside, the first feature was a display for the Beatles, recreating the Abbey Road album cover. Walking up the stairs and taking an elevator to an upper floor, you emerge out into the section known as the awards party. Here, there are multiple figures of famous actors, actresses, and musicians. While this wasn't too interesting to me personally, I observed that a lot of people in the attraction seemed to spend a lot of time taking photos here the most. Awards Party then transitions into a small segment known as Film. There are some small displays featuring British films such as Paddington, and of course 007, including a figure of every actor who has played James Bond. Just beyond this is another extension of the exhibit that explores film more broadly outside of the UK, but I was actually surprised with how small the film section actually is, considering how much more extensive the Orlando version happens to be with its equivalent theme. Moving into a hallway and down flights of stairs decorated like a station from the underground, you encounter a figure of Winston Churchill, and then emerge out into a section known as the Royal Palace. In this first room, you view wax figures of historical English people like William Shakespeare, as well as famous athletes, musicians, and others who have had a positive influence on British culture and history. This room then emerges out into a royal palace, featuring scenes of the royal family. I found this room to be particularly interesting, even though I only have surface level familiarity with the royal family. But moving on, this first quarter of the museum ends with a section known as Impossible Festival, highlighting famous and influential musicians. Not all of them are British, although they are featured a fair amount. Now, like Awards Party, this just wasn't that appealing to me, although I can understand why many people might think otherwise. Finishing out the first quarter of Madame Tussauds, the experience becomes a lot more intriguing and darker as you move down the stairs into the next section, known as the Chamber of Horrors. Newspaper on the wall alludes to the origin of Madame Tussauds, who famously created wax figures of famous people executed in the French Revolution, and those figures were then brought to London, premiering in a separate room known as the Chamber of Horrors. This updated version of the exhibit is very different, focusing instead on violent crime and serial killers, and so descending into the dark brick streets of historical London, you emerge out into the criminal underbelly of the city. Another viewer warning, but this next portion shows some scary imagery and strong strobing effects if you would like to look away. Stepping into a pub, The Blind Beggar, you first encounter Ronnie Cray, a famous British gangster who operated in the 1950s and 60s with his twin brother Reggie. Through the sound of gunshots and strobing lights, the room recreates Ronnie's murder of George Cornell from the Richardson Gang at the pub in 1966. Moving on, you walk through a short hallway with bodies wrapped up and stored in the walls, which provides a small jump scare as they struggle when you pass through. You next encounter John Christie sitting in his living room, whose crime was murder of multiple victims and his own wife, storing them in the walls, garden, and floorboards of his flat throughout the 1940s and 50s. While a wax figure, he does have some mechanical components that allow him to move, which is an interesting addition you'll see throughout this section. Traveling through another dark tunnel, the next display features John Haig, also known as the Acid Bath Murderer. He would dispatch his victims violently, forge their signatures to acquire money and possessions, and then dispose of the bodies by stuffing them into baths of sulfuric acid. Continuing, you enter His Majesty's prison and encounter the cells of other famous British killers, Dennis Nilsen and Ruth Ellis. Walking into an almost pitch black room, you're introduced to the famous Jack the Ripper, who I think needs no explanation. A figure stands in the middle, and as strobes and nearby lanterns flash, you hear audio of an atrocity in Whitechapel taking place, as the figure slowly raises his head. Finally, reaching the end of the Chamber of Horrors, you walk out into a hallway themed to the French Revolution, alluding to the wax masks and figures produced by Madame Tussauds herself. Exiting up a set of stairs, you enter a queue for the Spirit of London, an Omnimover-style dark ride that has you boarding a London taxi and moving through the history of the city. Stepping into the vehicle, the ride begins as you move through the pages of London history, traveling back 400 years and encountering moving wax figures in the court of Queen Elizabeth I. The next brief scene depicts William Shakespeare as he writes, and instantly, the next scene is much darker, depicting children succumbing to the bubonic plague as the figure of death is revealed through a lighting trick. The scene continues on to show a plague doctor near a cart with bodies, and suddenly, a woman up in a window is yelling that there's a fire in the city. Turning right, you view a watchman fighting the Great Fire of London in 1666, and the scene continues to depict Charles II employing Christopher Wren to rebuild churches within the city. Moving down a slope, a longer scene depicts the construction of St. Paul's Cathedral as Christopher Wren oversees the project. Continuing on around a bend, the vehicle is swiveled to the right, depicting citizens in a hot air balloon among fireworks as they observe a moving statue of Vice Admiral Lord Nelson, famous for his victory at the Battle of Trafalgar during the Napoleonic Wars. The next scene features Queen Victoria, who stands among machinery of the Industrial Revolution. After viewing figures working in the factory, the ride transitions to soldiers sheltering in a house as London is bombed in the 1940 Battle of Britain, and turning to the left, the vehicles move riders past a figure of Winston Churchill. Nearing the end, two fashionable models pose around a lamppost on Carnaby Street, and the final scene of the ride transitions to a fun fair. This appears to tie together many architectural icons of London, which includes Parliament and the Elizabeth Tower dressed up as a slide, and a depiction of Tower Bridge with a royal carriage gondola moving across it. Many of the figures found throughout and on the carousel also reflect iconic British roles, whether it's yeoman warders from the Tower of London or the King's Guard of Buckingham Palace. This finishes what is one of the quirkiest but most interesting rides I've ever been on, but there's still another quarter of the museum to cover, which I'll summarize quickly. Entering the Marvel Hall of Heroes, you'll instantly spot a wax figure of Nick Fury, as well as a massive figure of the Hulk who smashes through the ceiling, which you ascend up through using a staircase. Once at the top and facing the Hulk, you can turn and encounter a number of other Marvel heroes as well. This includes Spider-Man crawling on a ceiling, Captain Marvel flying through space, Black Panther posing in the jungle, and a figure of Groot with Rocket standing on his shoulder. Moving into the next room, which is a waiting area for a 4D film, you encounter figures of Captain America and then Iron Man, who is posed as if ready to fly. After waiting, you're led into a domed theater with probably the worst 4D film I've ever had to endure, where the superheroes visit Madame Tussauds to see their figures, but Loki comes and they have to battle. It's a whole lot of nothing, and leaving the theater, you enter the final segment known simply as Star Wars. Here, you encounter famous scenes and characters from the franchise, which in order covers Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon fighting Darth Maul on Naboo, a hateful Anakin Skywalker turned Darth Vader on Mustafar, Han Solo sitting in the Mos Eisley Cantina, Chewie piloting the Millennium Falcon, and Stormtroopers standing in what is probably the Death Star. Moving into the next room, you walk into an atmospheric rendition of Dagobah where you encounter Yoda, and turning to the left, the next scene portrays Darth Vader in Cloud City, where you can take a photo in place of Luke during this iconic scene. Another small room has scenes depicting C-3PO and R2-D2, a segment for Jabba and Leia in Jabba's palace, and an alcove where you can stand with Rey and BB-8. Finishing out Star Wars in the museum, the next room has a scene with the Mandalorian and Grogu as they walk on Tatooine, and around the corner, you can pose with the final figure, Ahsoka Tano. While I find the Madame Tussauds in Orlando interesting, I'm not the kind of person who really cares to pose with famous figures, but here in London, I did find the attraction to be much more worth my time. While the first quarter with celebrities and the royal family was somewhat enjoyable, I was surprised by the Chamber of Horrors and how different it was from what I anticipated. Walking through, I half expected there to be scare actors, but even without them, it was quite atmospheric and intriguing regardless. The main reason that I wanted to visit the museum was the Spirit of London though, which I wanted to ride just because it's so strange and unlike anything else I've experienced elsewhere. In many ways, its journey through London history reminds me of the old Omnimover rides of Epcot. While I know that Disney would never build anything like this today, I think it would actually be the perfect fit for the UK Pavilion, which would be loved by theme park fans through its strange quirkiness. While the Marvel section was short and the 4D film was boring, I do prefer these characters over the DC ones in the Orlando location. Finally, while I again did not feel the need to pose or take pictures with anyone, I did think the Star Wars segment was done pretty well, and I was glad to see some love for the prequel films on display in there too. Overall, I think that Madame Tussauds London is a better attraction than its Orlando counterpart, because not only was the Spirit of London a unique feature, but the actual themes of the wax exhibits have a lot more variety. There are other themed attractions that I visited while in London, but for now, I would like to instead return to something historical. I saw many sights in the city, many of which I will cover later in the video, but while there, I did visit 2 castles that were highlights of the trip. On the north side of the River Thames, right next to Tower Bridge, the Tower of London sits on the river, and it's one of the oldest structures in the city. Founded by William the Conqueror in the 1070s, the fort was part of a castle building campaign to establish and hold Norman power within England, and by 1087, work began on the permanent stone keep which sits at the center and is known as the White Tower. The Tower of London, which refers to the entire complex, went on to become one of the most significant structures in the history of England, going from royal keep and palace to an infamous prison for high-ranking members of society with a reputation for brutal torture and executions, and even to becoming a barracks, which lasted through the end of World War II. Since then, the complex has been mostly a tourist attraction which teaches about its dense history, and is a significant historical landmark. When visiting the Tower of London, you're able to take a walking tour led by the Yeoman Warders, which were established as a royal guard for Henry VII in 1485, but are now an honorable position held by distinguished and long-serving members of the British military who live on site. Walking around, the many buildings are filled with small exhibits or museums related to the castle's history, ranging from the service of Yeoman Warders to torture devices used when it was a prison. For over 600 years, the Tower of London even held exotic animals as an attraction for upper-class society, although reading accounts of how little standards there were for animal care and safety, many people were maimed or even killed when getting into close contact with the animals. The complex itself has some of the oldest surviving Tudor houses in London, as most of them out in the city burned down in the Great Fire of 1666, and a nearby stone structure is home to the Crown Jewels, which is a major draw to the site. You weren't allowed to film inside, so I don't have my own footage, but the exhibit was pretty brief, and it again evokes that feeling of surrealism by viewing such a history of wealth and craftsmanship up close. Towards the end of the exhibit, there's even a small conveyor belt that you stand on as you go past the history of jeweled items and crowns, which I found to be amusing. In the buildings of the inner wall, there is a small walk-through museum of how the rooms were furnished when royalty was living there, and on the lawn outside of the White Tower, there are shelters for ravens who can come and go as they please around the grounds. Ravens have been associated with the tower historically as protectors of the British crown, with myth claiming that Britain would fall if they were to ever disappear from the grounds. The largest attraction of the Tower of London is the White Tower itself, where, entering inside, it's an extensive museum of medieval arms and armor. The display notably contains different sets of armor worn by English monarchs for ceremonial purposes or sport, and its weapons range from swords to axes and even to cannons and firearms. This is unrelated to the museum, but as a former living space for royalty, the White Tower also contains the Chapel of St. Peter, which holds actual services. I find that to be interesting even though I don't subscribe to religion, so I think that's a neat upholding of historic tradition. While I haven't gone into much depth about its history, because really, that's something you should explore for yourself when visiting, I can say that the Tower of London was a fascinating experience, and one that also took up most of the day during its operating hours. Moving to the outskirts of London, another historic attraction I visited was Hampton Court, which was once a palace of King Henry VIII. The original court was founded in 1514 and constructed in the Tudor style by Thomas Wolsey, Archbishop of York, with the wings hosting various servants and visitors. However, falling out of favor with Henry VIII, Wolsey relinquished ownership in 1529, and Henry built a palace behind the original court, which included the Great Hall, a massive structure that is spectacular to view in person, where the king dined and guests were entertained. In 1689, William III and Mary II enacted plans to demolish and rebuild the palace one section at a time in a Baroque style, essentially because they were jealous of the elegance of the Palace of Versailles. After the passing of Mary, William lost interest in the project, and so today, you can see the two conflicting styles juxtaposed with one another. Moving throughout the palace, it's very much set up like a museum, just as with the Tower of London, teaching you about the history of Henry VIII and the lifestyle of English monarchs who lived in the newer Baroque structure. The grounds here have extensive gardens, all of which are maintained in different distinct styles, and the complex even contains a hedge maze which was first planted in the 1690s. Like with the Tower of London, I'm not going to get into the specifics of the history here, as I think that this is something that you should discover for yourself, but I did feel like I fully experienced what Hampton Court had to offer over the course of about 4 hours, although I do know that it offers more in the summer when more tourists are present. Walking around such an old complex with so much history is a striking and magnificent experience, and so, like the Tower of London, I highly recommend visiting if you're ever in the city. Returning back to themed entertainment, I next want to discuss the Merlin attractions found at County Hall. Located right off the Thames, County Hall opened in 1922 and hosted the local government of London until the ruling body was abolished in 1986. Since then, attractions run by Merlin Entertainments have moved into the building, which, if you were not aware, are the operators of Madame Tussauds throughout the world. They also operate the iconic London Eye, which unfortunately was down for maintenance when I visited the city, but their attractions on the waterfront also include the kid-focused Shrek's Adventure, which I did not experience, and the London Dungeon. Knowing that I wanted to experience a variety of Merlin attractions, as well as parks that they own and operate throughout the UK this upcoming summer, I actually purchased the Merlin Annual Pass, which allows admission to all of these attractions. Going into the London Dungeon, I had no idea what this experience was going to be like, and I initially thought that it was a scare maze. However, since you're not allowed to film inside, I'll just briefly describe it as a 2-hour walking tour, where as you move through different rooms, you encounter live actors who take you through gruesome London history and stories. Topics ranged from the gunpowder plot, to the persecution of witches, to the story of Sweeney Todd, and to a terrifying encounter with Jack the Ripper. I wouldn't say that the experience is scary so much as it is campy, but it's really well done and enjoyable if you go in with the right mindset. There's even a small drop tower located in the building to finish off the experience, which drops you maybe a pathetic 15 feet or so, as if you're being hung from a noose, but its outright stupidity is what makes it funny. I would like to talk about it more, but since my footage is limited, I can just tell you that it's worth experiencing. It was a fun surprise that I didn't have to pay for outside of the pass that I bought. The main attraction here though is Sea Life London, which is part of a series of aquariums owned and operated by Merlin as well. I really enjoyed the version in Orlando, which is a high quality experience and a lot larger than it looks from the outside, so I had high hopes for the version in London too. On initially entering, Sea Life starts with a strong impression as you walk over a glass bridge over a large tank with sharks swimming down below. I have certainly seen larger and more impressive reveals than other aquariums, but for the size of this space, I appreciate the effort. Stepping out of this hall, you round the corner to the elevators, where, taking one down, you let out to explore the first exhibit. This first section is known as the Atlantic Depths, which from the name, obviously indicates that the exhibits will feature fish found in the Atlantic Ocean. I wasn't sure what to expect from Sea Life London, but this first segment left a strong impression, with a large variety of tanks and an atmospheric nautical environment. Moving on, you next step into a small area designated as just Rays, with the path wrapping around a pool decorated to look like the shallows of a beach. For being a tank dedicated to rays, there were actually very few of them in here, and they were difficult to spot, but continuing further, The next thematic section of the aquarium opens up into a large room with views of a massive central tank. Known as the open ocean, you'll immediately notice fish swimming around the skeleton of a whale, which is known as whale fall. A significant phenomenon is a whale dying and falling to the ocean floor provides a feast for many bottom feeders. On the other side of the room is another window that looks into the tank, and if you watch for it, there are a few sea turtles swimming around. The path through this portion takes you through a tunnel inside the tank, which is a cool feature that obviously provides an interesting viewing perspective. Continuing into the next theme segment of the aquarium, you walk into Pacific Shipwreck, which again, I think the name obviously conveys the theme and the types of animals that you'll encounter here. There's a few smaller themed tanks that are interesting, but walking up to the large acrylic window, you'll spot sharks swimming around sunken Easter Island Moai, and quickly, you realize that this is the tank that you walked over when entering the attraction. There's a few smaller tanks to look through in this area as well, but proceeding further, you now experience the Coral Kingdom. This brief area takes you through tanks that depict shallow coral reefs with the appropriate colorful tropical fish, and you even encounter the large shark tank again, this time from a different angle. The coral theming then transitions to stonework, and having now entered the Seahorse Kingdom, this is a series of small tanks with fish who hide in seagrass, and of course the seahorses are the main feature. Thematically, the next change is very different as you explore the section known as Rainforest Adventure, which first introduces you to terrariums containing snakes, arachnids, and insects. However, moving further in and traveling through the dense jungle, other tanks include freshwater fish of tropical rivers. Some tanks include reptiles such as turtles and small crocodiles, and a highlight was the dangerous snapping turtles. Rainforest Adventure does continue on for a bit with larger tanks and more freshwater fish, many of which are impressive in their size. While the aquarium has also been pretty well themed up to this point, Rainforest Adventure also feels particularly atmospheric, full of dense foliage and props that work hard to try to sell the theme. Finishing up this area, you now walk through a hall with VR pods, which I found to be a bit of an odd addition for an aquarium. I didn't try them, but there are different experiences that bring you into a virtual world where you can encounter either humpback whales, sharks, manta rays, or mermaids. Proceeding further, the next segment is known as Rock Pool Discovery, which allows you to touch different invertebrates or unfertilized shark eggs. This is an activity that's always popular with kids at aquariums, but looking to the right, there's also a window into the largest tank of the aquarium with the sea turtles, which we previously encountered in the open ocean area. Like with the shark tank, I like how Sea Life is designed to continue giving you new perspectives on its larger exhibits, which is a fun idea throughout the course of the experience. The next themed area as we continue is titled Polar Adventure, and while small, it's distinctly different from everything that came prior. The single species of animal on display here are the Gentoo penguins, and among the icy Antarctic theming, the penguins will curiously swim up to the glass to observe you. While there are many employees throughout Sea Life who will tell you about the animals, I liked how here, specific penguins were pointed out by name, and a little backstory on their personalities was given, which is something that you rarely see in most other penguin exhibits, so that stood out to me as a positive element here. Nearing the end of the experience, you transition into Conservation Cove, which brings you back to the shark tank, but here, the walls display information about how to engage in good practices that promote ocean conservation. Moving further in, there's an additional tank with smaller fish as well, which reinforces the message and theme. Reaching the final area of the experience, you now step into Ocean Invaders, which is an entire segment that features various species of jellyfish. Admittedly, I do think the name is misleading, as I expected this to focus on invasive species. Instead, as far as I can determine, the name of the exhibit is trying to sound exciting by categorizing swarms of jellyfish as ocean invaders, despite them being appropriate species for their ecosystems, as if jellyfish weren't already dangerous, exotic, and intriguing. It's a cool exhibit with a fair number of interesting species throughout the tanks, and finishing up the experience, you walk up the stairs and exit through the gift shop. Overall, while not as impressive or extensive as Sea Life in Orlando, the London version is still excellent, and I appreciate its distinct theme sections. It's relatively short for an aquarium, especially compared to many of the massive ones I've experienced throughout the United States, but the time you spend in here is what you make of it, and I observed many people just relaxing by the windows and taking a substantial amount of time before moving on. I don't know if this is a seasonal issue or not, but I did observe that many tanks were sparse, and some were even completely empty, which wasn't really to the detriment of the experience since there was still plenty to see, but I did think it was odd. I haven't encountered any other aquariums with near-empty tanks, and even as I pointed out earlier, the ray tanks, which were a feature of a whole themed section, seemed almost completely empty of rays. It's just a strange observation I had, but for its small size, variety of animals, and sections with strong theming, I would say that Sea Life London is an excellent attraction that's worth visiting, especially if you're not from an area where massive aquariums are just absolutely everywhere. Visiting London in the winter isn't the best time to experience all of what the city has to offer, as many historical sites are being refurbished, or are simply not offering tours because they're in use, or because tourism demand isn't high enough for the tours to make sense. For this next segment, I wanted to discuss sites and attractions that were fun to see and walk to, but I couldn't experience because I either didn't have the time, or I just didn't come at the right time of the year. To start, I did stay right off of Kensington Gardens, which essentially merge into Hyde Park, and it's a great location that's central to a lot of attractions and historical sites within the city. The gardens themselves are home to many historical monuments, and of course Kensington Palace itself, which I wanted to experience, but it went under refurbishment right as I arrived. That said, I did have afternoon tea at the adjacent orangery, which is part of the palace, so that was a fun experience I haven't had before, as tea service is almost impossible to find in the United States. I did also have a day where I essentially walked the city to see many famous buildings, and so, only a few road crossings from Hyde Park is Buckingham Palace and the Mall, which is lined with famous buildings and statues that relate to the royal family and government operations. Buckingham Palace isn't really available for tours in January unless you want to spend a substantial amount of money, so at the very least, I was able to observe the exterior and walk the mall. An interesting building that I encountered was St. James Palace, which was built under Henry VIII in its distinctive Tudor style, and is a building with a lot of history behind it since. Another highlight was the statue of James Cook, who stood in front of the Admiralty House, or the Cavalry Museum, which was architecturally interesting, but not open to visitors at the time that I was there. However, on the street-facing side, you could encounter the Royal Horse Guards, which is one of those quintessential things you do as a London tourist. Not too far from the mall is Trafalgar Square, named after the famous Napoleonic naval battle that I highlighted as a scene from The Spirit of London. While decorated with many figures and fountains, Trafalgar Square is anchored by the Nelson Column that honors the Vice Admiral himself, and the attraction to experience here is the National Gallery, which again is not a place I had time to visit. Walking down to the Thames from here among rows of beautiful but important government buildings, I eventually made my way to the Palace of Westminster, which is stunning to see in person. While I again couldn't tour the building, it was still interesting to walk by and view its magnificent architecture, knowing that this too is an institution with a lot of dense history. I'll make the obligatory correction that this tower here is called the Elizabeth Tower and not Big Ben, which refers to the bell that's actually inside. I noticed that very few tourists came over to view the Victoria Tower though, which is larger and in my opinion, just as interesting to study and view. Across the street is Westminster Abbey, which again, I didn't have time to experience, but I can always appreciate the elegant and complex architecture of old European churches. As much as I would have liked to have toured everything that I saw, it is just fun to walk the city, because there are historically and architecturally interesting buildings just absolutely everywhere. From pubs to churches and government buildings, walking the city is an attraction in itself. Another highlight was Piccadilly Circus, which I really didn't know much about, but was surprised to discover that it's essentially the London version of Times Square. It's full of LED billboards, is host to many musicals, and the streets are full of touristy restaurants and shops. As someone who enjoys touristy kitsch, I actually like this area quite a lot, even though I was essentially just walking through to get somewhere else. When I first arrived in London, I wasn't sure what I wanted to film or if I even wanted to produce a video at first, so unfortunately, I did not film my experience at the London Zoo. It's located in Regent's Park, which I did film a bit of when walking through later in the trip, so I'll just show that footage on screen, but I do want to promote the London Zoo as one of the best that I've ever experienced. Opening in 1828, The original complex was built to actually house the animals from the Tower of London, and on a map, it appears small, but it took up a substantial amount of time to walk through. A big thing that stands out to me is that many of the exhibits were open air, as in, you could walk among squirrel monkeys who would run around and swing from the trees above you, or watch leafcutter ants traverse open ropes to travel to a series of open-air terrariums. That's not something I've ever seen a zoo do before, so that left a strong positive impression. In terms of sightseeing, you might be wondering if taking a bus tour through London is worth it, and if you're staying there for more than a few days, then I would say no. While bus tours probably offer plenty of information on the sights you'll see in the city, they're actually very expensive. Taking actual public transportation is significantly cheaper, and I saw most sights of the city daily when just traveling by public bus. That said, I did spontaneously take a boat tour on the Thames from a dock right under the London Eye, and that was not only informative, but allowed me to view a lot of buildings on the river from a unique perspective. The tour started by traveling under Westminster Bridge to view Parliament, which from the Thames might actually be the most impressive perspective of it. The boat then turned and traveled the other direction, pointing out many famous bridges, government buildings, and hotels that could be seen from the water. An interesting fact that I learned from the tour was that St. Paul's Cathedral is legally required to be viewable from its immediate area of the city. While London doesn't have too many skyscrapers, there are a good handful which have strange architecture and shapes, which were designed to be the way they are because they would not obstruct views of the cathedral, resulting in some very interesting architecture and city planning. There's a lot that I saw and learned about on the tour, but I also wanted to highlight that it travels next to the Tower of London and under Tower Bridge before turning around, so I thought that it was also worth mentioning, especially if you're interested in taking photos. There's a lot to see and do in London, but even traveling to the famous sites without taking tours, I did find that walking the city and filming or taking photos of these buildings made for a fun day in itself. One very clear lesson that I learned from staying in London for 2 weeks is that in terms of attractions, there's far too much to see in just one trip. There are interesting restaurants on every street, there are tons of historical places I did not tour or see at all, and of the places I did go to, many took up the entire day, like with the Tower of London or the British Museum. Spending only a few days in London is not nearly enough time to see close to everything that it has to offer, so even having been there for 2 weeks, there's still so much I want to return to and experience. One last attraction that I did not mention is the Warner Bros. Studio Tour, which is right outside of the city and allows you to tour the actual studio where much of the Harry Potter films were shot. It's an extensive experience where you're able to view the costumes and props from the films and explore the actual sets used, all while teaching you about how many of the effects were achieved for certain scenes. As someone who isn't a huge fan of the films, even I found this to be incredibly interesting, especially since I booked a private tour, which came with a lot more information and additional perks. Admittedly, it was also very interesting because of how familiar I am with what Universal has built, so I was actually surprised to see how different many things were. For example, I've been through Gringotts dozens of times at Universal, but walking through the actual set, there's 1,000 tiny little differences that make it feel like a completely different place than from the theme park adaptation, which I found to be really interesting. I debated how extensively I should cover this, but I think it could probably be an entire video in itself, so perhaps sometime soon, I'll produce a video that covers this attraction more extensively. Overall, London has a ton to offer, much of which I didn't even mention, like the many restaurants I went to, or the musicals that I experienced, but what surprised me was just how dense the city is in terms of attractions. You really have to dedicate more than one day to certain museums, and there are many historical sites that I would like to return to and book a tour. If you made it here to this point in the video, I hope that this was interesting in a different kind of way from the videos that I usually produce, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like to boost its exposure. As always, if you have not yet subscribed and hit the bell notification yet either, you can do so now to be alerted to new videos as they're released.